Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for coming to my presentation of my dissertation research on peer effects within homeowner adoption of solar PV panels, a case control study of 3 Northern California cities. Now, climate change is expected to cost Californians tens of billions of dollars per year. And California, within the US, is the second largest emitter behind Texas. But California also has one of the most ambitious emission reduction plans. AB 32 requires a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And also, residential buildings account for approximately 20% of US energy use. So residential buildings matter. And one viable strategy for reducing emissions is solar panels. Yet homeowners are sovereign persons. They will adopt PV only of their own volition. They can't be forced. They have to be persuaded somehow. So that leads to the question, what motivates homeowners to install solar panels on their roofs? And in particular, how significant is it if they know another homeowner who's already done it? So the method that I used is called a case control study. And this is the same type of study that was used to link smoking to lung cancer. And the cases are cases of rare behavior. The controls are controls. They do not exhibit the rare behavior. So in this case, the rare behavior is PV adoption. It's so rare that you can't sample like you would in a normal cohort study. So I went to planning offices within San Francisco, San Jose, and Fresno, and I collected contact information for a number of PV adopters. These are homeowners who are just barely beginning the process of installing solar panels on their roofs. I tried to get them as early in the process as possible. Now this set was supplemented with another set of homeowners who are not solar panel adopters. They're not in the process and they've never put solar panels on their roofs. And the solar panel adoptions, they were taking place around the end of October 2010 into the beginning of 2011. And from these 2 groups of homeowners, I solicited environmental, economic, social, and other information through a questionnaire. And once I got all the data, I performed both univariate analyses and logistic regression analyses. The output is probability of PV adoption within a year. So these are probabilities. This is a probabilistic study. The output, it ranges from, it's a fraction between 0 and 1. These fractions are quite low because PV adoption is so rare. The easiest way to interpret these probability numbers is the expected number of PV adoptions per the number of PV suitable homes. And so, okay, I'm going to start with environmentalism. One of the main things that I was looking at is, this is common sense. You would think that someone who is more environmental would have a higher probability of PV adoption. Very simple. But environmentalism it's a difficult thing to measure. And attitudes, beliefs, and values have not necessarily been shown to translate into behavior change. I was also worried about people changing their attitudes and their beliefs and their values as a function of beginning the process of installing solar PV. So I was worried that cause and effect would be confused and that would lead to misleading results. So I focused on behaviors. So that's a caveat when I'm discussing these environmentalism findings. But what did I find? I found that, and I was pretty surprised by this, adopters really resemble non-adopters very much. They recycle and compost to the same degree. The number of owned vehicles that they have adjusted for household size was the same, and their average miles per gallon of that fleet was the same. Within residential energy management, they set their heater thermostat at the same, approximately the same temperature. They're just as likely to have increased their home for energy efficiency. They're just as likely to have enrolled in a green power program, such as PG&E's Climate Smart, and that was very rare. And then when you look at energy consumption, so the amount of energy consumed per square foot per occupant, then they were the same. So after adjusting for home size and household size, they were the same. So they really resembled, adopters resemble resembled non-adopters. The only differences that I did find were very weak. Adopters are more likely, they purchase more organic produce, and they're more likely to own a hybrid vehicle. And both of these things are purchasing behavior. So what do these three things, PV adoption, organic purchasing, and hybrid vehicle ownership, have in common? They're all purchasing behavior, and they're all somewhat regular, recurring, normal purchasing decisions. So that is weak evidence that people are behaving environmentally only within purchasing behavior, and to the extent that the purchasing decision is very easy. But once again, this is only based on behaviors. So it could be very true that adopters are motivated by environmentalism, but if you look at their behaviors, they're not really walking the walk, except for PV adoption. And I'll have more to say about that at the very end. Now, economic considerations. Here I looked at ability to pay, which is affordability, which is basically wealth or income. And then I looked at reactive motivation and expected cost savings motivation. So basically, the greater the income, the greater the probability of adoption. That's my hypothesis. And lo and behold, adopters do have higher incomes than do non-adopters. Now, here we have total household income along the x-axis. There are 4 different categories. And along the y-axis, we have the portion of those homeowners within each category who are adopters or non-adopters. Adopters will always be in green, non-adopters will always be in red. And you can very clearly see that as income increases, the portion of those homeowners who are adopters steadily increases. And indeed, the adopters' median income is $150,000, while that of non-adopters is $100,000. Now, what about reactive motivation? This is the idea that homeowners are responding to very high electricity expenditures. So they're unhappy with the status quo, so they therefore look for an alternative, that alternative being PV. This is a somewhat simplistic hypothesis, but the next one will be more sophisticated. And adopters do spend more on electricity than do non-adopters. And this is unadjusted for home size and household size. You can see here that pretty much all of the right-hand side of this is all adopters. And the mode for the adopters is at 101 to 150, whereas the mode for non-adopters is here. And if you look at the median monthly expenditure, it's almost twice that. The adopters is almost twice that for the non-adopters. Okay, now expected cost savings. This is probably the most realistic, the most sophisticated, but not super sophisticated. So this is simply saying that homeowners are not just responding to the status quo, but they're comparing the status quo to the alternative, to PV. I deduced each homeowner's PG&E marginal rate and their average rate. And PG&E rates are just like income rates. They're progressive. The more you consume, the higher the rate. So the average rate is always going to be less than the marginal rate. Now, I needed to estimate the PV rate faced by all homeowners. This took a little bit more work, but I was able to start with initial unit costs, and this is $1 per kilowatt installed. And this is available from California Solar Statistics, and it's available per city and based on the time of purchase. So it was pretty precise data. Then I took the California Solar Initiative subsidy into account, which was about $350 per kilowatt. The federal tax credit, which is a further 30% reduction. And then I assumed a 4% 20-year financing. And then I also had to account, I got the annual solar production estimated for people who live in either San Jose, San Francisco, or Fresno, and that's available from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Putting that all together, I was able to come up with expected PV rates. And you see that they're the most expensive in San Francisco, least expensive in Fresno. They basically range from 19 cents to 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And then that faced by the non-adopters is just the average of the two quarters. So these are rates that are faced by all homeowners. Now, what did I find? I was able to test. I was able to see which rates and which types of evaluations best fit the data, and I compared average rates to marginal rates, and I found that people are really responding to average rates more than they are to marginal rates. So economic theory would lead us. It would be based on marginal rates, but it looks like people were actually responding to average rates. And now this binary evaluation, rather than a continuous evaluation, if you look at D1 average rate as an example, and you're going to see this throughout the presentation, this is a binary evaluation, and it compares the average rate of PV to the average rate of PG&E electricity. And for PV, the average rate is the same as the marginal rate. There's only one rate for PV. And if you do a binary evaluation where you say simply, is PV electricity cheaper than PG&E electricity, then it's a 1 or a yes, or a 0, no. And whereas the continuous evaluation would actually subtract them, so you would be looking at the difference. And what I found was that the binary evaluation fit the data much better than the continuous evaluation. So that indicates that people really are, well, I'll get to the, so for the economic considerations, the ability to pay or income is significant. It was significant, but there's a caveat on this also that you'll see, so keep it in the back of your mind. Expected cost savings motivation fit the data better than reactive motivation did. So people are, which is encouraging. People are not just reacting to the status quo and jumping off a boat without knowing where they're landing. They know somewhat what they're doing. But it was a very simple calculation, very simple estimation, and it really came down to just whether or not the average rate for PG&E is more expensive than the rate for PV. And because it was a binary evaluation, that really means that differences in payback periods are really irrelevant within this realm. It only matters whether or not you're going to make your money back, not how quickly. That's what I found. Okay, now social influences, and this was the brunt of the research. I asked people, how many homeowners do you know who have had PV installed on their roofs? Then I also asked about ST, which is solar thermal, so that's solar hot water. And then I also asked about energy efficiency. How many homeowners do you know who have increased the energy efficiency of their home? I asked how many of those persons were family or neighbors. I asked about how many of those people do you know who had problems? And this was inspired a lot by solar thermal, which had a checkered past in the 70s. And then I asked about solar panel opponents. Do you know anyone, or how many people do you know who have never had solar but who have expressed a negative opinion of them? And that was inspired by, in the beginning, some people were really anti-PV because they felt that it would hurt the property values. And then I threw in how many people do you know who own a hybrid vehicle, and how many households do you know who separate their food waste for compost? And those were just proxies for innovativeness. How innovative are the people that you hang out with, or that you know? I found that the number of problems within each technology was significant but weak. Problems were pretty rare, especially for solar, for PV, impressively rare. For solar thermal, they were at the highest, and that does reflect their troubled past. So even though they were rare, they were significant. If you knew someone who had problems, it was significant and decreased your probability of adoption. The number of known opponents was also significant. It was also rare, but a little bit stronger than problems. And your peers, your known adopters, was very significant and very powerful. All three of them individually were, but it was really overpowered by known PV adopters. That was by far the most powerful of the three. And you can see that it very clearly, a plurality of PV adopters knows two other adopters. So these are very clearly different distributions. And indeed, the adopters' mean number of PVs was 4.5 times that of non-adopters. And you can see this when you put it into binary form, just knowing 0 or at least 1, more than half the non-adopters know 0, whereas only about 10% of the adopters know 0. And this pertains to diffusion innovation theory also. And I'll talk about that more in a second. I also found that the portion of known adopters who are family or neighbors is significant. And the reason that you would think that this would be significant is because we value family more, so they're more salient to us. We value their opinions more. And as for neighbors, that would be establishing a local social norm, that it's okay to put solar panels up on your roof, that that's an acceptable thing to do in your neighborhood. Now, I also looked at, so I've shown that it matters who you know, but does it also matter what you talk about? And so I collected information on discussion time with known adopters. How much did you discuss solar panels with these people that you know, with these adopters that you know? And then I asked how much of 4 different content types were discussed. So either informational content, which is the practicalities of solar panels, the purchase, the installation, the financing, the practicalities. Environmental content, how much did you discuss the environmental benefits of solar panels or increased energy efficiency? Social norm content, how much did you talk about other homeowners who were putting solar panels on their roofs? And then finally, signal content. How much do you view solar panels as an opportunity to express yourself to others that you're doing your part? Kind of like conspicuous consumption or conspicuous conservation. And for discussion time, first of all, let's just look at homeowners in general, non-differentiated. They are discussing solar panels a good amount. At least 90% of them, or almost 90%, have discussed them at least a little, and almost 50% have discussed them at least a moderate amount. And again, put into binary form, you can see a clear difference between adopters and non-adopters. So people are really talking amongst themselves. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because PV adopters at this point, because the technology is still relatively new, only about less than 2% of households have adopted them, these people are still considered innovators. And innovation diffusion theory would say that innovators march to their own drummer, and they don't really talk to a lot of other people. They're not basing their adoption on other people's opinions. But I found that people really are talking a lot amongst themselves. And then just in the final model, when I put everything together, so even though discussion time was significant here, when you put it together with all the other variables, it falls out. It's overpowered by the other variables. Now, I found that informational content was discussed the most, and which makes sense. Then environmental content, and social norm and signal content were not discussed very much at all. But I found informational content to not be associated with PV adoption. So non-adopters are discussing informational content just as much as adopters are. So it doesn't translate into PV adoption. And that's important. And you can see that right here. There's really no difference between those distributions. And only environmental content was discussed amongst adopters than non-adopters. So it was the only content type that was associated with PV adoption. And these findings, so a lot of people who would acknowledge that the peer effect, that we're influenced by each other and that we're adopting innovations because of our peers, they could say, well, the mechanism behind that is information, that we're simply learning from each other, and we're gaining credible information from those people, and then we go and put it into our own calculus and make our own decision like we would with any other type of information. But what I found refutes that. People are not reacting to an information deficit problem. They're reacting to it's a values-based explanation for PV adoption. The more that the environmental benefits are invoked, the more people are valuing those environmental benefits, and therefore the more likely they are to adopt. Okay, now for the final model, putting it all together, PV adoption is a function of D1 average rate, and that's whether or not the PV rate is less than the PG&E electricity rate. The number of known PV adopters, the portion of known adopters who are family or neighbor, the amount of environmental content discussed, the number of known opponents, and then also a few new variables that I haven't discussed yet. Desired independence from PG&E. I asked people, how much do you value the independence from PG&E that comes from solar panels? And this was really inspired. A lot of people, especially in San Francisco, really hate PG&E. So it was powerful. It was more powerful than I expected. And then for demographic information, it was really education level and left-leaning political orientation. Now, the things that didn't make it into the final model were income. This was also extremely surprising. But this is not to say that wealth doesn't matter. Wealth does matter. Like we saw, adopters are richer than non-adopters. But what's happening is that wealth is operating indirectly through electricity rates. The wealthier people, they have larger homes and larger households, and those have higher electricity rates. So their consumption, their electricity bills are much bigger. So wealth does matter, but it acts indirectly through D1 average rate. Now, panel location, I also looked at whether or not each non-adopter's panels, if they were to put panels, would it be appropriate for them to be on the back or the front? And I thought that this would make a difference. A lot of people don't like the aesthetics of solar panels, so they would want them on the back. I found very weak support for that. It didn't really seem to matter. It seems like solar panels have been pretty widely accepted. I also looked at the citywide prevalence of PV, so the number of solar installations to date within each city. You would think that the more common it is in your city, the more likely you are to do it also. And I found that not to be the case. that indicates that if there's any social norm that's being established there, it's too diffuse to really affect individual behavior. It's more about your peers than about the city as a whole. Now, the diagnostics for the model, it explains more than 50% of the variability in PV adoption, which is pretty good. I mean, this is a complicated behavior, and it's not easy. I mean, it's ambitious to claim, to attempt to comprehensively explain human behavior. And that wasn't my whole, I wanted to try to do that as much as possible, but I was really interested in the pure effects and economic effects. And the model, when compared to the respondent set, it predicts PV adoption correctly 90% of the time. Okay, now here's the model evaluation. This is evaluated for the average non-adopter. And the average non-adopter D1 average rate is 0.15. So you can interpret that as being, for this group, only 15% of that group is PV rate cheaper than PG&E rate. On average, they know almost one PV adopter. About 40% of their known adopters are family or neighbor. They discussed environmental content a little. They know about one opponent. They value the independence from PG&E a moderate amount. They've completed some college, and about half of them have a left-leaning political orientation. And when you evaluate that, the probability of adoption is 1 out of 1,000. And when you apply that to the number of PV-suitable houses in San Francisco, San Jose, and Fresno, that translates into about 288 expected adoptions within a year. Now, what about the marginal effect? How effective is each variable? D1 average rate is huge. It's much bigger than I expected, and it really can't be ignored. But it's a little bit misleading because it's a binary variable. So you're changing this from 0 to 1, whereas for known PVs, the marginal effect is calculated by just adding one more known PV. So for D1 average rate, you're going from the minimum to the maximum, whereas for known PVs, you're just adding one more. And known PVs, if that is family or neighbor, then it triples, just adding one from the mean. So this is going from 0.8 to 1.8. So, or one known adopter to 2 known adopters. You're tripling their probability of adoption. So it's pretty powerful. Okay, my conclusions. So outside of PV adoption, adopters behave no more environmentally than do non-adopters. Yet the discussion of environmental benefits was significant. It was powerful, and it was correlated with PV adoption. So what I think is going on here is a cognitive dissonance explanation. People know that they're not behaving as environmentally as they would really like to. They would like to behave environmentally, but they know that they're not, and that creates cognitive dissonance that they alleviate through PV adoption. So from this perspective, PV adoption is a behavior that in lieu of other environmental behaviors, not an element of a wider pro-environmental behavior set. Okay, for the economics, the economic consideration was much simpler than expected. Income really just operated through, it all came down to D1 average rate. Whether your the expected PV rate is less than the average PG&E rate. It came down to that. So this type of behavior is in line with classical microeconomic behavior. You're trying to increase your utility, but it's adapted to a bounded rationality, meaning that people are satisficing more than they're maximizing. It's an estimate. It's not a calculation. And this makes sense. People are, they're making estimations. And this refutes the information deficit explanation. It supports a values-based explanation. So people are discussing the practicalities of adoption, but that's not persuasive. It doesn't translate into PV adoption. It's not like once they get good information, then they will adopt. It didn't make a difference. What did make a difference was environmental content. So the more that the environmental benefits were discussed, and these environmental benefits, this isn't new information. Pretty much everyone knows that solar panels are environmental. So this is being reinforced. It's not new information, it's been reinforced, and that causes people to value the environmental benefits more, thereby increasing their probability of adoption. And homeowners are indeed being influenced by PV adopters. And this chart shows that. So this is just known PV adopters and probability of adoption. And this is with all other variables held at the non-adopter's mean. So this is for the average non-adopter, the average homeowner. As you increase the number of known PV adopters, the probability of adoption steadily increases. And someone who knows 10 versus someone who knows 0 has the factor. It's about a factor of 128. So this person has 128 times higher probability of adoption. So it's significant. And I also found PV adoption to be driven by interpersonal communication to a degree greater than would be expected by innovation diffusion theory. Like I said before, these people are so early in the game, they're considered innovators, and there's supposedly they're leaders who don't really care about other people, but that's not really what I found at all. But is this due to the peculiarities of PV, such as its cost, its complexity, its visibility, its almost permanence, or is there a general change in innovation adoption behavior going on? I don't know which is which. Now, comparing economic considerations to social influences, and this is my last point, really. Social influences are powerful. They account for almost 4 times the variability that economic considerations do. So people's changing, their behavior is more explained by social influences than it is by economic considerations, based on what I found. But the marginal effect of D1 average rate is so huge that it can't be ignored. It's extremely powerful. And that's shown in this graph. So this is for D1 average rate equals 1. So the PV rate is less than the PG&E average rate. And this is for D1 average rate equals 0. The PV rate is greater. And this is once again with all other variables not shown held at their mean. You can see that the change is much higher for D1 average rate equals 1 for this line. And what this really shows is that if you're comparing an economic policy to a social policy, let's say you're at known PVs equals 3. Going from the blue line to the red line, so changing rates such that PV rate is less than PG&E rate, gets this increase in probability. Whereas if you're introducing someone to a known PV adopter, you're only going to get this probability versus minus this probability. So the difference is much smaller. The marginal effect of switching from the blue line to the red line is huge. So what does that indicate? It indicates what the policy implication is that a most cost-effective policy would be tailored to each prospective adopter. So if the PV rate is greater than, if the PV rate is greater than the PG&E average rate, then it makes sense to subsidize, to try to get, it makes sense to get someone from that blue line to that red line. You basically, you want to get people off of this blue line as quickly as you can. But then if someone is on that red line, if their PV rate is already less than their PG&E rate, it makes no sense to further subsidize them. Then you want to introduce them to an adopter. So then if you're already on the red line, you want to introduce them to as many adopters as possible. So you basically figure out where you're starting. Are you on the blue line or the red line? And then you want to, as quickly as possible, get to the red line and then increase people's known, introduce them to known adopters. And this happens, it happens around $200 a month. So if you're spending about $200 a month on electricity, then you're going to be on the red line. Below that, you're going to be on the blue line. So these are for households that are larger, larger sizes, and they spend a good amount of money on electricity each month. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask? Yes.
Did you look at differences between your different larger cases, so between the cities? There are a lot of demographic differences I can think of, so did you look at that?
Yeah, I did, and it didn't, the differences within the cities, it didn't matter. Compared to once all the other variables were in there, they got swamped. It was the more precise person-level data was more powerful.
Don't be shy. Give it a try. McAdam Custom says. Yes.
I guess this is just out of curiosity, but you kind of glossed over it pretty quickly, but the conspicuous consumption factor, were you able to delve into that at all? I mean, I know it's something that'd be very hard to test because nobody would answer honestly on a.
Yeah.
You could put a Prius in your driveway.
Well, I did. What I looked at.
Putting the panels up there, that's like.
Right. You would think it would be the same kind of thing, right? I looked at how much people value that expressive ability, and then I looked at whether or not, and I interacted that with whether or not their panels were in the front or in the back. You expect the more that they valued expressing themselves, the more they would want it on the front. But I found very little evidence for that. So
I guess the question is, do you think that's something that can be really measured, or is that based on withholding information?
Yeah, well, the only part that was based on the questionnaire for that was how much they value expressing themselves through solar panels, and I think that would probably be pretty accurate. There's not a huge motive to lie for that.
Unless they're lying to themselves.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that the development of the solar leasing model would affect the types of conclusions that you're?
Yeah. Well, basically, what I found was that the D1 average rate it was so significant it best matched people's behavior. You're basically saying that the rate you're paying is instantly less than PG&E's rate, and that's what the leasing commercials are saying also. They're saying, hey, you can drop your electricity costs immediately, and so it's basically the same kind of thing. But this data, my data was taken before leases were common, so this data is based on not on leases.
So if anything, you would kind of expect that to increase the probability of uptake?
Yeah. I think probably the people in those solar companies, already kind of knew this, and that created that leasing business model. Mark?
So as far as whether they have their panels on the front or the back, wouldn't that typically be determined, at least in the first instance, by where they get more sun exposure? So that the solar company would say, you can't have it in the back if there's too many trees, you've got to have it in the front. How would you sort that out from how eager they were to show off what they were doing?
Right. Well, I looked at each house for its southern exposure and said, and identified was there southern exposure on the front, the back, or maybe the front and the sides, or the back and the sides, and then I looked to see if that functioned into their adoption, into their probability of adoption, and if there was a strong preference to express themselves or a strong preference to hide the panels, then it should be significant, but it wasn't.
So,
Yeah.
do you have any ideas on how to introduce non-adopters to adopters?
Yeah. So it would be pretty simple if you wanted to. During the permit process, you would ask the homeowner if they were willing to talk to other homeowners about solar panels. If they said yes, then you would collect their contact information, including their zip code, compile that information, and then give it to an intern or a staff member and station them outside of a grocery store and say, hey, are you interested in solar panels? If they say yes, and you say, well, what zip code do you live in? Say, well, I can put you in touch with 5 of your neighbors who have already done it. So it would be quite simple, but I performed a cost-effectiveness analysis. I really, to be honest, I was surprised by how powerful D1 average rate was. I was surprised by how powerful the economic considerations were. And when I did a cost-effectiveness analysis for an average homeowner using an economic policy versus a social policy, you would have to have a successful, it would have to cost you $2.30 per successful introduction in order for it to be cost effective. So if you're paying someone $10 an hour, they would have to make 4 successful introductions per hour. It's not nearly as cost effective as I thought it was going to be. I was surprised. I was really, really surprised by that.
Here's your chance. Yes?
Did you consider the source credibility? You looked up if the known adopter is a family member, but did you also consider the if you know that the person, or if you know a person who you think is a very innovator and as a person that you look up to is an adopter?
Yeah.
That have a bigger influence than just a regular family?
Yeah, I didn't go into that much depth on that issue. It was really just the family or neighbors. I had to keep the questionnaire to less than 5 minutes and a few pages. So that was, it would have been nice to know, how salient is that person to you and how credible is their information. But I wasn't able to go into that much depth. But it did, the fact that family and neighbor was quite significant does show, I would think, indicates that saliency matters. That credibility, saliency matters. Yep.
Since you've done the survey, I feel like, well, one, I'd be curious to hear your opinion on how prevalent you think the knowledge of solar panels has changed between now and before, and also if you think that would have an impact on knowing an adopter or not, or is it possible that with increased knowledge, there's now just a general norm around solar panels where the knowing an adopter, having somebody close to you, that effect might?
Yeah, it's still quite rare. It's still only approaching maybe 2% of owner-occupied homes. And the differences between the non-adopters and the adopters was so stark that I think it would take a little while for that to become less stark. So it seems like there are people who know a lot of other people, but then there are a lot more people who really know zero. Mark?
Well, that being the case, if you think about the typical diffusion curves that you see in diffusion generation literature, they're typically S-shaped.
Right.
So we're still kind of in the flat part of the S. If we thought we were near the inflection point where after a certain point would take off, we just had some more adoption, then maybe this strategy of introducing adopters to non-adopters, even though it might look expensive, in the long run it might actually be very cost effective, because if you get to that inflection point, then you get quite a big impact.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Are there any way to measure that?
Yeah, my analysis was not dynamic. So if you took those down the road, or those secondary contacts into account, then maybe the cost effectiveness analysis would look better. And we are, I mean,
There's a better chance of changing that than changing their utility costs.
Right. There's no more subsidies. PG&E costs are probably going to go up. I mean, they are going up, and there's a chance that they'll go up more. But
so they're helping.
so that will help. But yeah, there's no more subsidies, and we are. I mean, well, this is not right, but people really are talking amongst each other, and it would. I think there is a possibility for it really being more effective than what my pretty simple analysis, cost effectiveness analysis showed. Yep.
So the cost of spreading the good word is a constraint. But are there other techniques for doing that might not cost as much?
Yeah.
As an example, letting the solar panel installers distribute the information on their own?
Yeah.
Or putting it in with a PG&E bill? I don't know whether they've agreed with it.
Yeah. Well, the installers are already doing it. I mean, they don't even need to advertise. They just rely on word of mouth. So I guess they're taking advantage of it. They're not really supporting it or propagating it anymore. But if it really is constrained by the cost so much, it seems like maybe this would be, you would have to try to get away from the labor costs and maybe set something up online, maybe something through Facebook where PV adopters could join and say, I just installed solar, I love it, and then other people who are thinking about it could maybe find that page. That would be more cost effective than relying on an intern or a staff member that you're paying labor costs to. Yeah, Sean?
It seems to me that one strategy might be to subsidize some very highly influential people in the network. So find people who know lots of people, or whose opinion is valued, or something, and subsidize them. Don't try to introduce them to somebody new whose opinion they might not value.
Right.
But the other part of the dynamics is that if you subsidize some people and they adopt, then everyone who knows them suddenly has effectively been introduced to an adopter.
Right.
And so it may turn out to be more cost effective to subsidize a small number of influential people. Think of sort of contagion models,
Right.
and if you think of it that way, it seems to me that you could be strategic and have a big effect at relatively modest cost.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the two-pronged policy is kind of that idea. You want to make it as tailored as you can. And if you could identify people on that blue curve who are connected and influential, then it would make a lot of sense to subsidize them.
You have to figure out how to identify those people.
Yeah.
That's what you're.
I hope the committee members don't use up their questions in the public session. We gotta save some for the next 2 hours.
I just wanted to comment on that previous comment that companies in business markets utilize that strategy because they know the value of influential reference customers. So they often sell new technology with a significant loss to customers who are considered as highly influential, important reference customers. And this strategy has not been discussed so much in the kind of consumer marketing literature, but your results are kind of suggesting that that strategy might work very well in the consumer marketing settings.
Right. It also supports kind of the demonstration projects, but this is like a more, a more closer to home kind of demonstration project. It's not the government, it's someone that you actually know.
Okay, I think we probably had enough for this session. Let's thank our speaker.